It was a typical Monday morning at Jefferson High School, and the hallways were already alive with the familiar buzz of students hustling to their classrooms. Teachers stood by their doors, some sipping coffee, others chatting briefly with colleagues before the bell signaled the start of another week. In room 203, Mrs. Carla Henderson, a well-respected veteran teacher with over 2 decades of experience, was preparing for her first period class. Her reputation as a no-nonsense educator preceded her. She believed in order, discipline, and the idea that every student could thrive under a firm hand. As the tardy bell rang, the classroom settled into a hum of quiet activity. Students flipped open their notebooks, and Mrs. Henderson began her lesson. But it wasn't long before the calm was interrupted. A tall, sharply dressed man entered the room, a coffee cup in one hand and an easy smile on his face. He looked out of place among the teenagers in their hoodies and sneakers. The man scanned the room briefly, as if he were taking everything in, before heading to an empty seat at the back. Mrs. Henderson's eyes followed him, her expression unreadable. She hadn't seen him before and assumed he must be a new student, perhaps one of the transfers she had heard about last week. "Excuse me, young man," she called out, her tone clipped but not yet confrontational. "You're late. Do you have a pass?" The man, or boy, as she assumed, paused mid-stride and raised an eyebrow. "No, ma'am. I just needed to sit in for a bit." Mrs. Henderson frowned. She didn't tolerate disruptions or vague excuses, and this was shaping up to be both. Sit in for a bit? This isn't a cafeteria or a study hall. Either you're here to learn, or you need to head to the office and sort out where you're supposed to be. The man's smile faltered slightly, but he nodded. "I'll do that, but first, I'd like to observe." The room was silent now. The students, sensing the brewing tension, exchanged glances. It wasn't every day they saw someone challenge Mrs. Henderson. Her eyes narrowed. "Observe, are you auditing my class?" "Something like that," he replied, his tone calm and measured. Mrs. Henderson's patience was wearing thin. She wasn't about to let a defiant student disrupt her class. "Young man, I don't know who you think you are, but rules are rules. If you're not on my roster, you need to leave." The man sighed, set his coffee cup down on the desk nearest to him, and stood his ground. "With all due respect, Mrs. Henderson, I'm not here to break any rules, but I'd appreciate it if you'd allow me to stay." That was the tipping point. Mrs. Henderson's voice rose slightly, carrying an edge that made even the most notorious troublemakers in the room straighten in their seats. "Enough. Either you show me your schedule, or I'm calling the office to escort you out." The man hesitated for a moment, then reached into his pocket. For a second, Mrs. Henderson thought he might actually produce a schedule or some kind of hall pass. Instead, he pulled out a slim leather wallet and opened it to reveal an ID card. He held it up for her to see, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Henderson squinted at the card, the words Dr. Marcus King catching her eye, followed by the title beneath it, Superintendent of Jefferson County School District. For a moment, the room was utterly silent. The air felt thick, as if everyone was collectively holding their breath. Mrs. Henderson's face froze in an expression of shock, her carefully maintained authority slipping away. The students, who had been trying to stifle their laughter and whispers, could no longer contain themselves. A ripple of gasps and murmurs filled the room. "Superintendent?" Mrs. Henderson repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes darted between the ID card and Dr. King's face, as though trying to reconcile the two. Dr. King gave her a small, almost apologetic smile. "Yes, ma'am. I'm here on an unannounced visit. I like to see how things operate on the ground level. Real classrooms, real teachers, real students." Mrs. Henderson's cheeks turned a deep shade of crimson. Her mouth opened as if to say something, but no words came out. It was clear she was grappling with the sudden turn of events. The students, sensing the rare vulnerability in their usually unshakable teacher, were barely containing their amusement. "I didn't mean to cause a disruption," Dr. King continued, his tone kind but firm. "But I do think it's important to address something here. Discipline is a cornerstone of effective teaching, but so is understanding." Mrs. Henderson's eyes flashed with a mix of embarrassment and indignation. She straightened her posture, as though trying to regain some semblance of control. "Dr. King, I didn't realize. If I had known who you were..." Dr. King raised a hand to stop her. "That's exactly the point, Mrs. Henderson. You didn't know. And that's what makes this interaction so valuable. Let's not focus on titles or authority. Let's focus on the lesson we can learn from this." The tension in the room was palpable. Mrs. Henderson's mind raced as she tried to process everything. Meanwhile, the students were watching with wide eyes, their excitement bubbling just beneath the surface. No one knew what would happen next, but one thing was certain. This Monday morning was anything but typical. Dr. King took a step forward, his gaze sweeping over the room. "Shall we continue with the lesson?" he asked, his voice steady and reassuring. Mrs. Henderson hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. Then, with a deep breath, she nodded. "Of course. Let's get back to it." But as she turned to the whiteboard, the weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Everyone in that room knew they were part of a story that would be told and retold for years to come. What no one could predict was how this unexpected encounter would ripple through the school, challenging long-held assumptions and sparking conversations that went far beyond the walls of room 203. The morning dragged on, but the unease lingered. Mrs. Henderson found herself struggling to focus on the lesson. Words seemed to blur as she wrote equations on the whiteboard, her usual crisp delivery faltering. The students, however, were more engaged than ever, their eyes darting between her and Dr. King, who sat quietly in the back, his gaze attentive but unreadable. He didn't take notes, nor did he speak again. He simply observed, his presence commanding the room without a single word. By the time the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, Mrs. Henderson felt as though she had been holding her breath the entire time. She dismissed the students, her voice betraying a rare hint of uncertainty. As they filed out, many of them glanced back at Dr. King, their curiosity and excitement palpable. A few whispered among themselves, their words a low buzz that Mrs. Henderson couldn't quite make out. Dr. King remained seated, his coffee cup now empty and resting on the desk in front of him. Mrs. Henderson hesitated, unsure whether to address him or simply let him leave. Finally, she cleared her throat. Dr. King, I want to apologize if I was too harsh earlier. I wasn't aware of who you were. Dr. King looked up at her, his expression softening. There's no need to apologize, Mrs. Henderson. You were doing what you thought was right, but perhaps there's an opportunity here for both of us to reflect. Her brow furrowed slightly, and she leaned against her desk, crossing her arms. Reflect on what, exactly? On how we approach discipline, he replied simply. On how we view authority and respect, and how those things intersect in a classroom setting. Every interaction is a chance to learn, wouldn't you agree? Mrs. Henderson nodded slowly, though she wasn't entirely sure where he was going with this. I suppose so. Dr. King stood, gathering his wallet and empty cup. I'll be around the school for the rest of the day. If it's all right with you, I'd like to sit in on a few more classes. Perhaps we can discuss this further later on? She hesitated, then gave a small nod. Of course, whatever you need. He smiled again, that same easy smile that seemed to put people at ease and unnerve them all at once. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I appreciate your understanding. As he left the room, the tension didn't dissipate. Instead, it seemed to settle deeper into Mrs. Henderson's chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger, something that would force her to question not just her methods, but her very approach to teaching and discipline. And as the next group of students filed into her classroom, their chatter filling the space, she knew that the day was far from over. The second period began with a noticeable energy shift in room 203. Mrs. Henderson's usual sense of control felt distant, replaced by an undercurrent of unease that even her new batch of students seemed to pick up on. They noticed her stiffness, her distracted glances toward the back of the room where Dr. King had sat. The news had spread fast. By now, most of the school likely knew what had happened. Whispers and snippets of conversations buzzed through the hallways like an uncontainable wildfire. Meanwhile, Dr. King had moved on, but his presence lingered. Mrs. Henderson couldn't shake the way he had observed her, not with judgment, but with a piercing clarity that unnerved her. She tried to push it from her mind as she launched into her lesson, but the day's rhythm refused to settle back into normalcy. Down the hall, in another classroom, Dr. King was sitting in on a history lesson. The teacher, Mr. Harris, was younger and more relaxed in his demeanor. Unlike Mrs. Henderson, he welcomed the unexpected visitor with genuine curiosity, even excitement. Good morning, Dr. King. It's an honor to have you here, he said as he shook his hand firmly. Thank you, Mr. Harris, Dr. King replied warmly. I'm looking forward to seeing how you engage your students. Mr. Harris dove into his lesson with enthusiasm, weaving in anecdotes and inviting open dialogue. Dr. King watched attentively, occasionally jotting down notes in a small leather-bound notebook. The students responded well to Mr. Harris' style, their participation lively, and their interest genuine. It was a stark contrast to the rigid atmosphere of Mrs. Henderson's classroom, and it didn't go unnoticed by Dr. King. As the day progressed, he continued to make his rounds, quietly taking in the varying dynamics of the school. Each classroom painted a different picture of teaching and learning, of authority and engagement. Some teachers thrived on structure, others on flexibility. Some students were eager participants, while others remained disengaged, their heads down and their minds elsewhere. During lunch, Dr. King opted to eat in the staff lounge, much to the surprise of the teachers gathered there. His arrival caused a stir, conversations faltered, and all eyes turned to him as he entered the room. He'd offered a polite nod and grabbed a seat at one of the tables, setting down his tray. Mind if I join you? He asked a group of teachers who were mid-conversation. Of course not, Dr. King, one of them said quickly, pulling out a chair for him. The group shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to navigate this sudden proximity to the district's top leader. Dr. King, however, had a way of putting people at ease. He asked questions about their experiences, their challenges, and their successes. Slowly, the conversation grew more relaxed, and the teachers began to open up. They spoke candidly about the pressures they faced, large class sizes, limited resources, and the difficulty of balancing discipline with empathy. What do you think is the most important factor in connecting with students? Dr. King asked, his tone thoughtful. Respect, one teacher said without hesitation. If students feel respected, they're more likely to respect you in return. Another chimed in, but it's not just about respect. It's about understanding where they're coming from. Some of these kids are dealing with things we can't even imagine. Dr. King nodded, his expression contemplative. It's a delicate balance, isn't it? Maintaining authority while fostering understanding. The teachers exchanged glances, their earlier unease fading into a sense of camaraderie. Dr. King's presence, while initially intimidating, had opened the door to a dialogue they rarely had the opportunity to engage in. By the time lunch ended, the staff lounge felt less like a place of hierarchy and more like a shared space of collaboration. Meanwhile, back in room 203, Mrs. Henderson was struggling to keep her focus. The events of the morning replayed in her mind on an endless loop. She thought about the way Dr. King had handled the situation, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with her own defensiveness. She prided herself on being a firm but fair teacher, yet something about his words had struck a nerve. As the final bell of the day rang, Mrs. Henderson lingered in her classroom, her hands methodically organizing papers that didn't need organizing. She was startled when a shadow fell across the doorway. "Mrs. Henderson?" Dr. King's voice was calm, as it had been earlier, but it carried a weight that demanded attention. She looked up, her heart skipping a beat. "Dr. King, what can I do for you?" He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I wanted to thank you for allowing me to observe this morning. I know it wasn't an easy situation." Mrs. Henderson managed a tight smile. "I appreciate you saying that. It certainly was unexpected." Dr. King nodded, then paused as though considering his next words carefully. "I hope you understand that my intention wasn't to undermine your authority. On the contrary, I have great respect for the work you do. Teaching is one of the hardest jobs there is." She relaxed slightly, though her nerves were still on edge. "I believe in discipline, Dr. King. It's the only way to keep order in a classroom." "I understand," he replied. "And discipline is important, but so is adaptability. Each student, each situation requires something different. It's not an easy balance to strike." She hesitated, then said, "You're suggesting I change my approach." "I'm suggesting you consider broadening it," he said gently. "There's no one-size-fits-all method when it comes to education. Sometimes the toughest lessons are the ones we teach ourselves." His words lingered long after he left the room, leaving Mrs. Henderson alone with her thoughts. The day had been a whirlwind, but it was clear that its impact would be lasting. For Mrs. Henderson, for Dr. King, and for everyone at Jefferson High School, the conversation was just beginning. The rest of the day unfolded like a tightly wound spring, each moment coiled with tension and unspoken questions. Mrs. Henderson couldn't focus. She found herself replaying the interaction with Dr. King over and over, dissecting every word, every gesture, and every expression. How had she missed the clues? The authority in his voice, the poise in his demeanor, they all pointed to someone far removed from the typical student. Yet she had overlooked it, blinded by her own assumptions. As the afternoon wore on, Dr. King continued his unannounced tour of the school, his presence stirring conversations wherever he went. Students whispered about the man who had stood toe-to-toe with Mrs. Henderson, while teachers exchanged nervous glances, wondering if he'd visit their classrooms next. Some were intrigued, others apprehensive, but no one could deny the ripple effect he was having on Jefferson High. In the faculty lounge, the air buzzed with speculation. A few teachers tried to piece together the morning's events, drawing conclusions from secondhand accounts. "Did you hear?" Henderson thought he was a student. One teacher whispered, barely able to contain their amusement. "No way," another replied. "She must have been mortified. You know how she is about rules." "It's not just her," a third interjected. "This whole school runs on that kind of rigidity. Maybe this is the shakeup we need." Not everyone shared the sentiment. Some worried what Dr. King's visit might mean for them. Would he be critical? Would changes follow? The uncertainty only heightened the collective anxiety. Meanwhile, Mrs. Henderson found herself at the center of a storm she hadn't anticipated. Her colleagues avoided bringing up the incident directly, but their sidelong glances and hushed tones spoke volumes. She felt exposed, as though the sturdy walls of her reputation were cracking under the weight of scrutiny. For someone who thrived on control, the feeling was unbearable. In the late afternoon, Dr. King attended a school-wide assembly scheduled long before his arrival. The topic was a routine one: upcoming events, sports achievements, but his presence transformed it into something far more charged. As he walked onto the stage to address the students and staff, the room fell into a hushed anticipation. Dr. King began by commending the school on its strengths, its dedicated teachers, its promising students, its vibrant community. His words were measured, his tone warm, but there was an underlying seriousness that demanded attention. "I want to talk about growth," he said, his voice carrying to the farthest corners of the gymnasium. "Not just academic growth, but growth as individuals, as a community. Growth requires reflection. It requires us to ask hard questions and to challenge what we think we know." The room was silent, every ear tuned to his words. He spoke about the importance of understanding, of meeting people where they are, and of finding a balance between discipline and compassion. Without naming anyone, his message subtly echoed the events of the morning, and those who knew the story couldn't help but feel the weight of his words. As the assembly ended, the applause was thunderous, but Mrs. Henderson's claps felt half-hearted. She couldn't help but wonder if his speech had been aimed, in part, at her. The thought unsettled her. It wasn't often that she felt unsure of herself, but today had been nothing but a series of moments that chipped away at her confidence. When the school day finally came to a close, Mrs. Henderson stayed behind, her classroom empty and quiet. She needed the stillness to process everything. The knock on her door startled her. "Mrs. Henderson, may I come in?" Dr. King stood in the doorway, his expression neutral but inviting. "Of course," she said, gesturing for him to enter. She folded her hands on her desk, bracing herself for whatever was coming. Dr. King took a seat across from her, his posture relaxed but attentive. "I wanted to check in with you before I left for the day. It's been an eventful one." She nodded, a small, rueful smile tugging at her lips. "That's an understatement. I want to acknowledge how difficult it must have been for you this morning," he said. "Being put on the spot like that, it wasn't my intention to make you uncomfortable." She appreciated his candor, but it didn't erase the lingering embarrassment. "Thank you. I suppose I could have handled it better." "We all could in some way," he said gently. "But that's the beauty of this profession, isn't it? It's a constant learning experience for students and teachers alike." For a moment neither spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, but reflective, as though both were considering the implications of the day's events. Finally, Dr. King leaned forward slightly. "You're a dedicated educator, Mrs. Henderson. That much is clear, but dedication doesn't mean we stop evolving. The best teachers are the ones who are willing to grow alongside their students." His words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Mrs. Henderson felt the weight of them, but she also felt a spark of something else. Curiosity, perhaps. A part of her resisted the idea of change, but another part, buried deeper, wondered if there was truth in what he said. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. Dr. King smiled, a genuine warmth lighting his face. "That's all I ask." As he left the room, the tension that had filled the day seemed to dissipate, leaving Mrs. Henderson alone with her thoughts. The conflicts that had surfaced were far from resolved, but the seeds of something new had been planted. What would grow from them remained to be seen. Mrs. Henderson was still reeling from the unexpected turn of events when lunchtime finally arrived. She'd been on autopilot all morning, going through the motions of her lessons while her mind replayed the encounter with Dr. King. By the time she reached the faculty lounge, she was desperate for a moment to gather her thoughts. Yet, as she entered, it was clear the room was abuzz with speculation, and she was at the center of it. The whispers quieted slightly as she walked in, but the curious glances didn't stop. A younger teacher, Mr. Alvarez, approached her cautiously. "Hey, Carla," he said, lowering his voice. "Is it true? The superintendent's here undercover." She gave him a tight-lipped nod, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "It's true," she admitted, trying to keep her tone neutral. "He sat in on my first period class." The room went silent for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Then, one of the older teachers, Mrs. Patel, spoke up from her corner. "Well, it's about time someone from the district came to see what it's really like in these classrooms. Maybe this will finally spark some meaningful changes." Another teacher chimed in, "Or it could mean more scrutiny, more pressure. You know how these things go." Mrs. Henderson listened quietly, her coffee cup warming her hands. The faculty's reactions were as varied as her own feelings, part apprehension, part curiosity, and part defensiveness. But before she could contribute to the conversation, her phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Dr. King, requesting a meeting after school. Her heart sank slightly. What more could he want to discuss? She already felt as though her authority had been challenged in front of her students, and now the prospect of a one-on-one meeting only heightened her unease. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Dr. King continued his observations, visiting several classrooms and speaking briefly with teachers during passing periods. Each time he appeared, the air seemed to change, as though everyone was holding their breath. Students, too, were on edge. Whispers about the undercover superintendent spread like wildfire, fueling a mix of excitement and nervousness. By the time the final bell rang, Mrs. Henderson was exhausted. She made her way to the designated meeting room, where Dr. King was already waiting. His demeanor was calm, but his presence felt as commanding as ever. "Thank you for meeting with me, Mrs. Henderson," he said, gesturing for her to take a seat. She nodded, sitting down across from him. "Of course, Dr. King. How can I help?" He leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. "First, I want to thank you for your candor and professionalism this morning. I know it wasn't an easy situation, and I appreciate how you handled it." She wasn't sure if that was meant as a compliment or a gentle critique. "Thank you," she replied, her tone cautious. "I try to maintain high standards in my classroom." "And that's commendable," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "But I couldn't help but notice something today, not just in your classroom, but across the school. There's a sense of rigidity here, a strictness that, while effective in some ways, might be limiting in others." Mrs. Henderson bristled slightly. "I believe structure is important. It helps students understand expectations and prepares them for the real world." Dr. King nodded. "Absolutely. But what happens when that structure becomes so rigid that it leaves no room for individuality, for creativity, or for empathy?" She opened her mouth to respond, but he continued. "I saw students today who seemed afraid to make mistakes, and while discipline is necessary, it shouldn't overshadow their ability to learn from those mistakes. There's a balance to be struck. His words hit a nerve, though she couldn't quite say why. For years, she prided herself on her ability to maintain order and discipline, but now she found herself questioning whether her approach was as effective as she believed. Before she could respond, Dr. King shifted the conversation. "There's another reason I wanted to meet with you," he said, his tone taking on a more serious edge. "During my visit, I encountered something that concerns me deeply." Mrs. Henderson stiffened. "What do you mean?" "I spoke with a few students in passing," he said, choosing his words carefully, "and some of their stories highlighted a pattern, a feeling of being unheard, of being dismissed when they expressed their struggles. It's not unique to your classroom, but it's something I want to address." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Mrs. Henderson's first instinct was to defend herself, to argue that she always had her students' best interests at heart, but something in Dr. King's expression stopped her. He wasn't accusing her, he was inviting her to reflect. "I've always believed in holding my students to a high standard," she said finally, "but I never intended to make them feel dismissed." "And I don't believe you did," Dr. King said gently. "But intention and impact don't always align. That's why this is an opportunity for all of us to grow." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Mrs. Henderson nodded slowly, though her mind was racing. She couldn't deny the truth in what he was saying, but accepting it meant reevaluating everything she built her career on. As the meeting ended, Dr. King stood and extended a hand. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Henderson. I look forward to working together to make Jefferson High the best it can be." She shook his hand, her grip firm despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "Thank you, Dr. King. I'll do my best." As she left the room, her thoughts were a tangled mix of pride, doubt, and determination. The stakes had been raised, the challenges laid bare, and while the path forward was uncertain, one thing was clear: change was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. Continuing the narrative, the school's day unfolded with a mix of heightened curiosity and unease. Dr. King's presence was felt everywhere he went, leaving a trail of speculation and whispered conversations among students and faculty alike. His observations were thorough but unobtrusive, and while he seemed cordial, his focused demeanor hinted that he wasn't merely passing through. Teachers who encountered him found themselves scrutinizing their words and actions, wondering if their usual routines would stand up to his standards. By the time the last period of the day approached, Mrs. Henderson had barely managed to hold herself together. The meeting with Dr. King loomed heavy in her thoughts. She replayed the morning's events countless times, each memory more humbling than the last. She'd always seen herself as a model of discipline, an educator whose methods were justified by results. But Dr. King's words had planted seeds of doubt, and now those seeds were growing into an uncomfortable realization. When the final bell rang, she waited anxiously in the designated meeting room, nervously straightening the papers on the desk. Moments later, Dr. King entered with his usual calm composure. His easy smile contrasted sharply with the weight in Mrs. Henderson's chest. "Thank you for making time for me again, Mrs. Henderson," he began, settling into the chair across from her. "I wanted to discuss my observations today, and more importantly, the larger implications for our district." She braced herself, nodding slightly. "Of course, Dr. King. I'd like to hear your perspective." He leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "First, let me say this. Jefferson High has many strengths. It's clear the teachers here care deeply about their students' success, but I also notice something that concerns me: a pervasive atmosphere of fear rather than mutual respect. Students seemed hesitant to speak up, to ask questions, or to engage openly. That can hinder learning." Mrs. Henderson felt a lump form in her throat but forced herself to respond. "I understand where you're coming from. The structure is essential. Without clear boundaries, things can quickly spiral out of control." Dr. King nodded thoughtfully. "Structure is important, yes. But what kind of structure are we building? One that nurtures curiosity and growth, or one that prioritizes compliance at the expense of creativity and connection?" His words struck a chord, and for a moment she didn't know how to reply. But then he continued, his tone softening. "You see, Mrs. Henderson, I've been in schools where discipline was valued above all else, and while they appeared orderly on the surface, they struggled with deeper issues: retention, engagement, even mental health. The balance I'm advocating for isn't about being lenient. It's about fostering an environment where students feel safe enough to take risks, make mistakes, and learn from them." Before she could respond, Dr. King shifted gears. "And there's one more thing. During my observations, I came across a student who felt dismissed during a critical moment, a moment where a little understanding might have made all the difference." Mrs. Henderson's heart sank. She knew what he was referring to, and the weight of it pressed down on her. "You're talking about this morning," she said quietly. "Yes," he replied, his tone even. "And I want you to know my presence wasn't meant to undermine you. I admire your dedication, but I think there's room for growth for all of us." Her defenses softened, and she met his gaze. "I've been teaching for a long time, Dr. King, and while I believe in my methods, I'll admit I've never stopped to think about the impact they might have beyond academics." "That's a brave acknowledgement," he said with a nod, "and it's exactly the kind of openness we need to move forward." But just as the conversation seemed to reach a moment of mutual understanding, Dr. King dropped the unexpected twist. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, "I've been thinking about how to address these challenges district-wide, and I believe you're the right person to lead the charge." She blinked in disbelief. "Me? Lead? In what capacity?" "I'd like you to spearhead a new initiative on restorative practices," he explained. "It's a program designed to help teachers balance discipline with empathy, to build stronger relationships with their students while maintaining high standards." The room fell silent as Mrs. Henderson processed his words. She felt both honored and overwhelmed. The offer was unexpected, and yet it felt like an opportunity to redefine not just her career, but her approach to education. I don't know what to say," she finally admitted. Dr. King smiled warmly. "Say yes, and together, we'll make Jefferson High a model for schools across the district." As the weight of his words settled in, Mrs. Henderson realized this wasn't just about her or her classroom. It was about something much larger, a chance to reshape the culture of education, one lesson at a time. And though the path ahead was uncertain, she felt a flicker of hope, knowing she wouldn't be walking it alone. Mrs. Henderson stood frozen for a moment, letting the silence of the now empty classroom sink in. The confrontation with Dr. King had left her shaken, her thoughts spiraling in ways she hadn't experienced in years. She had always been so sure of her methods, so confident that her rigid approach was what her students needed. Yet, in the space of a single encounter, she felt the foundation of her beliefs begin to wobble. The day moved on, but Mrs. Henderson couldn't shake the lingering tension. She taught her subsequent classes with a mechanical efficiency, avoiding eye contact with her students more than usual. When lunchtime finally arrived, she found herself retreating to the sanctuary of her car instead of the teacher's lounge. There, she stared at the dashboard, replaying the events of the morning over and over. What troubled her most wasn't Dr. King's authority, or even his critique. It was the undeniable truth in his words. Meanwhile, word of the encounter spread through the school like wildfire. Students texted, whispered, and speculated, and by the time the final bell rang, everyone from the janitor to the principal seemed to know that the superintendent had been in Mrs. Henderson's classroom. The speculation wasn't limited to the students. In the staff lounge, teachers debated whether Dr. King's visit was a prelude to district-wide changes, and more than a few wondered if their own classrooms might be next on his list. That evening, Mrs. Henderson sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold beside her. She opened her laptop and began researching restorative practices, a term Dr. King had casually mentioned during their conversation. As she read about programs that emphasized dialogue over punishment and understanding over authority, she felt a mixture of skepticism and intrigue. Could these methods really work in a school like Jefferson High? More importantly, could they work for her? The next morning, Mrs. Henderson arrived at school with a newfound determination. She decided to confront the situation head-on, starting with Dr. King. After the morning announcements, she made her way to the principal's office where she had been told he was stationed for the day. As she approached, her palms grew clammy, but she steeled herself, knowing this conversation was necessary. "Dr. King," she began, finding him seated at a desk reviewing notes. He looked up and smiled warmly, gesturing for her to sit. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, setting his papers aside. "Good to see you. What can I do for you?" "I've been thinking a lot about what you said yesterday," she admitted, her voice steady despite the nerves tightening her chest. "And I have to say, it's made me question some of my methods. I'm not saying I agree with everything, but I'd like to learn more about what you're proposing." Dr. King's smile widened, and he leaned forward. "I'm glad to hear that. Change doesn't mean throwing out everything you've built, Mrs. Henderson. It means evolving. I'd love to work with you on this." Over the following weeks, Mrs. Henderson found herself at the forefront of a district-wide pilot program on restorative practices, with Dr. King as her mentor and collaborator. She attended workshops, sat in on meetings with students, and even invited her colleagues to observe her experiments in the classroom. It wasn't easy. There were moments of frustration and resistance, both from her students and herself, but gradually she began to see results that she couldn't ignore. Students who had once been defiant or withdrawn began to engage. Conversations replaced confrontations, and respect became a two-way street. One day, several months into the program, Mrs. Henderson found herself in a particularly lively classroom discussion. The topic wasn't math, but a question she had posed to her students. "What does respect mean to you?" The answers were raw, honest, and often surprising. For the first time, she felt like she truly understood her students, not just as learners, but as individuals. Later that afternoon, as she was packing up for the day, she noticed Dr. King standing in the doorway of her classroom. "I couldn't help but overhear," he said with a smile. That was quite a discussion. Mrs. Henderson returned his smile, her heart swelling with a quiet pride she hadn't felt in years. "It's still a work in progress, but I think we're getting somewhere." Dr. King nodded. "You've done remarkable work, Mrs. Henderson. The district is already seeing the impact of what you're doing here." As he left, Mrs. Henderson sat down at her desk, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She realized that the encounter with Dr. King had been more than a wake-up call. It had been an opportunity to grow, not just as a teacher, but as a person. In the end, the story of Mrs. Henderson and Dr. King became a legend at Jefferson High, a tale retold to incoming staff and students alike. It wasn't about humiliation or triumph, but about the power of understanding, humility, and the willingness to change. And for Mrs. Henderson, it was a reminder that even the most seasoned teachers could learn new lessons.